The following is a world-class Bullshitters exclusive.
What is the greatest film of all time? That is a question asked daily. Of the hundreds of thousands of films made, one stands above them as the most impactful film of all time: Star Wars. Star Wars is often regarded as the greatest cinematic achievement in history. Created by George Lucas and released in 1977, Star Wars would change the way movies are made, marketed, and consumed. Star Wars' popularity would continue to grow through its two sequels, The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Star Wars would become a cornerstone of pop culture for decades to come. Years after the release of the films, George Lucas and company would reintroduce Star Wars to the next generation through the special editions and the prequel trilogy. Star Wars would take on a whole new life as the saga expanded from 3 films to 6. There would be mountains of criticism levied against Lucas for his creative decisions, but the films were successful, ushering in a new era of Star Wars to a new generation. After completing this saga, George Lucas decided to sell Lucasfilm. According to him, from a 2020 interview, it would take another decade to complete a trilogy, and with a new child on the way, George Lucas would ultimately sell his company to Disney. On October 30th, 2012, the Walt Disney Company purchased Lucasfilm for $4 billion, with half of the money paid in cash and the other half in Disney stock. Lucasfilm had previously worked with Disney's Walt Disney Imagineering division to construct Star Wars and Indiana Jones themed theme parks for various Walt Disney parks and resorts throughout the world. Kathleen Kennedy, Lucasfilm's co-chairman, was named president, reporting to Walt Disney Studio chairman Alan Horn. She also works as the Star Wars brand manager, collaborating with Disney's various lines of business to grow, integrate, and optimize the value of this global franchise. Disney bought the operating business of Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and Lucasfilm in live-action film production, consumer items, video games, animation, visual effects, and audio post-production as part of the agreement. Disney also bought Lucasfilm Entertainment Technologies portfolio. In the fiscal year 2014, Disney began selling Star Wars merchandise. Certain products would be co-branded with the Disney name beginning with Star Wars Rebels. The Disney-Lucasfilm merger was approved by the Federal Trade Commission on December 4, 2012, allowing the acquisition to be completed without having to deal with antitrust issues. Lucasfilm Limited changed its name to Lucasfilm Limited LLC on December 18, 2012, after converting from a corporation to a limited liability company. Disney closed the transaction on December 21, 2012, and Lucasfilm became a wholly owned subsidiary of the company. At the time of purchase, it was also announced that a new Star Wars film was on the way, featuring the original cast. The film, ultimately titled Episode 7: The Force Awakens, would be met with great excitement, as Star Wars fans had something new to look forward to for the first time in a decade. The first trailer would stir up even more excitement. Movie theaters would screen the trailer on repeat for those willing to pay. Online, the trailer raked in hundreds of millions of views. The excitement was through the roof. In September of that year, fans were introduced to Force Friday, a midnight Star Wars toy release held across the country. Here, fans got their hands on toys of the new characters. Speculation was high as to who these characters were. On October 19, 2015, tickets would go on sale, breaking all pre-sale records. Another trailer was released as well. Star Wars was about to return, and millions were ready. On December 18, 2015, Star Wars Episode 7: The Force Awakens was released. On a budget of $306 million, the film would go on to make $2 billion at the box office. At the time, The Force Awakens was well received with critics and audiences. A small segment of the audience would critique the film for its lack of originality and similarities to the original Star Wars film. Fans would not have to wait long for another Star Wars film, this time a prequel, Rogue One: A Star Wars Story. Released less than a year after The Force Awakens, Rogue One followed the story of the crew of rebels who died stealing the Death Star plans. It was another hit for Disney. Rogue One was praised for its story in connection to the original trilogy. At the time, fans were enamored with the resurrection of CGI Grand Moff Tarkin and a de-aged Princess Leia. The scene that stole the show for most was the return of Darth Vader. Less than a year later, Disney would release the follow-up to 2015's The Force Awakens, Star Wars Episode 7: The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi would be directed by Rian Johnson, a director then best known for his film Looper. Johnson was announced as director in August 2014, over a year before The Force Awakens was released. The writing process for The Last Jedi was documented in the feature Director and the Jedi. This film was not mapped out prior to 2015, the year The Force Awakens was released. It was intended to have Abrams help Johnson, who would then help Episode 9 director Colin Trevorrow. This was Disney's plan to unite the trilogy. There was no overarching story in place, just films with release dates. Disney would ultimately regret this decision. There was controversy surrounding The Last Jedi. Before its release, Disney informed theater owners of their new demands. Pay up and follow the rules or you're not going to get Star Wars. The Wall Street Journal had this to say: before exhibitors can begin screening Star Wars: The Last Jedi this December, they must first commit to a set of top-secret terms that numerous theater owners say are the most onerous they have ever seen. Disney will receive about 65% of ticket sales from the film, a new high for a Hollywood studio. Disney is also requiring theaters to show the movie in their largest auditoriums for at least 4 weeks. Ignoring the terms carries an unusual penalty. If a theater violates any conditions of the distribution agreement, Disney can take an additional 5% cut, bringing the studio's total haul to 70% of sales on a movie likely to gross more than $500 million at the domestic box office. The case of The Last Jedi highlights a perpetual but growing tension between the business partners that bring movies to the public, studios, and theaters. Negotiations between the two parties have grown pitched as Disney has become one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood, and theaters have lost leverage as box office sales fall. The Last Jedi would go on to gross $1.3 billion worldwide, down nearly $750 million from the previous film in the saga. This time around, reviews were mixed as critics loved the films while fans did not. It would begin a multi-year-long battle between the fans, the press, and Lucasfilm. Around this time, fans would begin to question the leadership at Lucasfilm, with President Kathleen Kennedy at the center of everything. The home video release of The Last Jedi featured a documentary that showcased the making of the film. From it, fans got a glimpse at the inner workings of the new Lucasfilm creative process. It was obvious that Lucasfilm's lack of a cohesive vision for the saga was the reason The Last Jedi was much less focused and more disjointed than the previous film. Fans hated the treatment of saga hero Luke Skywalker, questioned the futility of Snoke, and groaned at the new character Rose Tico and Princess Leia's death-defying spacewalk. Many wondered why Rey didn't face the same adversity of Luke Skywalker. There was also an unusual amount of interest in a relationship between hero Rey and villain Kylo Ren. Disney didn't know where to focus their attention. Clearly, it wasn't on their next project. Continuing with the trend of releasing a new Star Wars film every few months, May 2018 saw the release of Solo: A Star Wars Story. Solo's backstory is much more interesting than the film itself. Legendary director Ron Howard was tapped to direct Solo, after the original directors were fired. Howard signed on to the film when it only had a few weeks of shooting left. Solo was initially supposed to be directed by Phil Lord and Chris Miller, the directing duo behind 2 21 Jump Street movies and the Lego Movie, but they were abruptly fired at a dangerously late stage in production. It was later reported that their freewheeling directing style clashed with Lucasfilm boss Kathleen Kennedy's more meticulous approach. Howard, an old friend of Kennedy's, was quickly brought in on board as a replacement days after Lord and Miller were sacked. What were initially reported to be routine reshoots lasting no longer than a few weeks turned into a 4-month race to the finish line as Howard, a veteran of the film industry, scrambled to deliver a $250 million film on time. And he did, with days to spare, even for the much-publicized screening at the prestigious Cannes Film Festival. A report in Variety said that Howard ended up reshooting 85% of Solo, which was enough to get him a sole directing credit on the film, with Lord Miller being relegated to executive producers. But Howard said that their fingerprints are all over the final cut. Solo ended up bringing in $392 million on a $275 million budget and was considered the first Star Wars flop. Any future plans for Alden Ehrenreich's Han Solo were ditched after Solo failed to deliver. After the failure of Solo, Lucasfilm spent the rest of 2018 licking its wounds. During this time, the war between the fans and Lucasfilm raged on as creatives began taking shots directly at the fandom, a new low for Lucasfilm. A portion of the audience held out hope for Star Wars Episode 9, but news surrounding the film wouldn't put them at ease. Before The Last Jedi was even released, Colin Trevorrow, then director of Star Wars Episode 9, was fired. This was not the first time a Star Wars director was fired. In 2015, before any of these films were released, Josh Trank was fired from his then-upcoming Boba Fett film. The reason for Trevorrow's firing was vague at the time, with Vulture stating, "The decision to bounce him from the project ultimately fell to Kennedy, who 5 years into her Lucasfilm tenure is showing less and less compunction about firing and replacing directors she feels are temperamentally or creatively unsuited for the job." Having also overseen the resignation of Fantastic Four director Josh Trank from another standalone Star Wars film in 2015. There's one gatekeeper when it comes to Star Wars, and it's Kathleen Kennedy, says a veteran movie producer who has worked with the studio chief. If you rub Kathleen Kennedy the wrong way, in any way, you're out. You're done. A lot of these young new directors want to come in and say, I want to do this and I want to do that. A lot of these guys, Lord Miller, Colin Trevorrow, got very rich very fast and believed a lot of their own hype. And they don't want to play by the rules. They want to do shit differently. And Kathleen Kennedy isn't going to fuck around with that. The trend of firing Star Wars creatives is still going on at Lucasfilm. Since Trevorrow's firing, there have been a handful of canceled Star Wars projects, with the most recent being Patty Jenkins' Rogue Squadron, a film set around a new group of X-Wing pilots in the sequel trilogy era. No official word was given as to the cancellation. December 2019 saw the release of the final chapter in the saga with Star Wars Episode 9: The Rise of Skywalker. The build-up to The Rise of Skywalker was focused on ending the saga in an all-encompassing way. The film featured the return of the Emperor as well as Billy D. Williams as Lando Calrissian. 2018's Solo: A Star Wars Story saw Donald Glover play a new, younger version of Lando Calrissian. The press surrounding this new Lando was his pansexuality and his heavily implied sexual relationship with his robot companion, L337, which some ultimately believed hurt that film. Star Wars' last theatrical film closed lower than the previous two in the saga. Critics were not as kind to this film as they were the previous two. While both The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi have critic scores in the 90% range on Rotten Tomato, The Rise of Skywalker sits at 52. This was the end of Star Wars in cinema. While The Rise of Skywalker was gearing up for release, Star Wars found its new home on Disney+. The Mandalorian was the first live-action Star Wars show. The show was successful from the jump. While it focused on the Mandalorian played by Pedro Pascal, the real star was what fans affectionately referred to as Baby Yoda. The Mandalorian would have its second season debut the following year, and fans and critics were met with a string of episodes that featured a series of backdoor pilots for upcoming Star Wars shows on Disney+. Some of those have already been canceled. The Mandalorian has a third season on the way. What Lucasfilm was finally able to do was create something in the Star Wars universe that was universally accepted. The Mandalorian sub-brand is highly successful, with a portion of it rivaling the sequel trilogy itself. So popular, in fact, that Disney failed to meet expectation with no merchandise available for the first season. There would be a handful of Star Wars animated series on Disney+, including a season of The Clone Wars, The Bad Batch, Star Wars Tales of the Jedi. The next live-action series would be The Book of Boba Fett, which did not deliver. Consensus on the show is, it's a confusing 7-episode mess that fails to establish a clear identity for its central character. The show fails to keep its focus on Boba Fett and Comrade Fennec Shand, two core characters of the show. Beset with pacing issues and the need to connect to other Star Wars properties, The Book of Boba Fett is a storytelling failure that holds lessons and warnings for the future Star Wars projects. The follow-up series Kenobi would fare no better, with critics saying, Obi-Wan Kenobi is a bad series and one that does more harm than good to the Star Wars universe. It raises numerous questions about A New Hope, damaging that film with important questions that this show has crowbarred into the lore. With the next 18 months already mapped out for Star Wars content, diehard fans will quickly move on and enjoy what's to come. For others, the damage is done in this series, and it may just be too great to ignore, souring the experience. As Obi-Wan himself puts it, I felt a great disturbance in the Force as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror. As of this video, Andor is in its first season. While slow, the show is generally well received, yet lacks the popularity the other series had. Time will tell, but the lack of quality in the Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan really turned off the Star Wars fandom in a way not seen since the sequel trilogy. Star Wars is lesser than it used to be. The once iconic brand is now just another notch in Disney's belt. Other franchises have usurped Star Wars. Marvel is this generation's cultural touchstone. Though it made money, what Star Wars lost over this decade can never be recovered. What Star Wars lost was the spirit that made it Star Wars. At its core, Star Wars is the vision of one man, and without that man, Star Wars is lost and has no direction. And now it's time for 3 questions. 1. What is your favorite Disney Star Wars property? 2. Where were you when you heard the announcement that Disney bought Star Wars? And 3. Do you miss George Lucas? It was fun making this video, folks, so do me a favor, go ahead and share it all over social media. That helps us more than you can possibly imagine. While you're feeling generous, click on the links down below to help support the channel. ShopWCBS.com features all kinds of wonderful t-shirts, but if you like art, you can pick up Wokebusters, Tits and Art, and a lot more. I'll be back on Tuesday night with the High Council, so don't miss out on that at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have guests, we have games, we have a lot of fun planned this week, but most importantly, we have you. So thank you folks in advance for joining us on Tuesday night. But I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go get prepared for that show as well as many other things that I have planned for this channel. But in the meantime, folks, be smart, be safe, be cool, but always be excellent to each other.
Thanks for watching today's video. Yes, it's over, but don't cry because there's more, a lot more from World Class Bullshitters. And there's only one way to get it. Hit that subscribe button below. When you do that, you'll get notifications and updates from World Class Bullshitters every time we go live. Basically, you won't miss anything. And if there's one thing I hate, it's FOMO. But the thing most people hate more than FOMO is fear of missing out on World Class Bullshitters, because there's just some things you can't undo. So folks, do yourselves a favor and never miss anything from World Class Bullshitters. One last thing before you go, hit the thumbs up button. Not for our egos, no, they're big enough as this, but it does help us fight the algorithm here, and well, it's man versus machine, and that's the real fight. But if that's not your battle, that's okay. There's one last way you can help WCBS, and that's going over to shopwcbs.com, picking up a t-shirt, a beer glass, a sweatshirt, a poster, all sorts of ways to back WCBS. The difference between us and other YouTube channels is I'm the artist that makes all this stuff, so if you enjoy art, beyond t-shirts, you can even read our comic books. We got it all. We're called the epitome of pop culture for a reason, and no, again, it's not for our egos. So folks, make sure you're involved with every aspect of World Class Bullshitters, not just for us, but do it for yourself. We're making the change in entertainment everybody out there wants to see. And a special thank you goes out to all of our wonderful patrons who make this content possible. Go to patreon.com/worldclassbs to get involved and help out the channel.